going.
Okay, and I should start sharing screen now?
Yeah, you can go ahead and share your screen. I'll pass it over to you.
Okay. Okay, let's see. There. Can you see that?
Yes, I can see the
Okay,
title.
perfect. Right. So yeah, thanks for having me. And it's great that so many classes are doing these projects. And from what I understand, a lot of them are to do with gardens and improving things for native plants and animals. And so I thought bats, birds, and bees would be a good topic. And of course, each one of these I could probably talk about for an hour or more each. So this is going to be kind of quick, but hopefully gives you some ideas and things to think about. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is bats. I'm also the provincial bat specialist, so bats are near and dear to my heart. We have over in the world 1,300 species of bats, so a lot of variety. Later in this talk, we're going to talk about pollination, and there are bats that are pollinators, but that's in the tropical parts of the world. So here in Alberta and in Canada, all our bats are small. Most of them are brown. We have a little brown and a big brown and some other brown bats, and they weigh, the smallest weighs about as much as a loonie, and the biggest weighs maybe 3 or 4 times that much. So they're really small. They all have eyes, they can see, but they do use echolocation to find insects because it's pretty hard in the dark to find something as small as a mosquito. So they're really adept at using sound and echolocation to find insects. And you don't need to be afraid of bats. They're very, very useful and important in the ecosystem. They are the primary consumer of nighttime insects. And so to talk a little bit about bats, first to understand them before we can help them, I mentioned they eat insects. So all the bats in Alberta eat insects, various kinds of insects. And I'm showing you a picture of a mosquito because that's one of our least favorite insects. And fortunately, it's one of the bats' favorite insects. So not only are they just an important part of the ecosystem, but bats help to control insect pests like mosquitoes, forest pests, and farm pests. So people really benefit from bats. And as you probably know, if you've hung around a pond or a wet area in the summer, there's lots of bugs there. So these little wetlands are really important for bats. Bats also drink. So having a nice spot, they just drink on the fly. They sweep down and have a little drink. So these ponds and wetlands are really important to support insects that bats eat. And so where do bats live? We know that they sleep during the day. And trees are one of the most common places that bats will roost. Usually they're big trees, and even dead trees that have holes and cavities are really preferred by bats because they like to go into these little warm places. They do also, you may know, sometimes go into buildings. There's a couple of species that will go into buildings. But overall, trees are pretty important to bats, and trees are important to insects as well. And especially for those female bats in the summer, most female bats have only one baby that we call a pup. And so that's why they need these warm roosts where they can raise their pups safely. And so how to help bats? I just talked about the places that they like to eat and the places that they like to sleep. So that's a really good place to start. So if you're able to maintain wetlands and all that lush vegetation around it, having lots of big trees around, if you have big trees that you can keep that aren't going to be a safety threat, they're not going to fall on your house, and keeping those big trees, we call them wildlife trees, that's really important as well for bats, places to roost and places for insects to live as well. So helping bats, a big part of helping bats is having all those components of a natural habitat. Now, sometimes we feel like we should give them a helping hand, and you've probably heard that people make bat houses, and bat houses can be useful. Again, this is a topic that we could spend a lot of time talking about. So I'm going to direct your attention to a great resource, which is the Alberta Community Bat Program, albertabats.ca. And this site has all kinds of information about bats of Alberta, how to build a bat house, what kind of bat house to build, where to put it, That we even have a citizen science project where people monitor bat roosts. So maybe they have a bat house, or perhaps they have a bat colony that's living in a shed or something like that. And so people will report how many bats they see coming in and out of the house. Some people even collect the bat poo, called guano, and we send that away to have DNA testing to find out what species, what kind of bats are in there. So that's pretty fun. I've actually just got some bat poo in the mail this week already. So there's lots we can do for bats. And again, I could spend a lot of time talking about them, but I think it's important to know that they're really important to the ecosystem. And our bats are facing a lot of challenges. And throughout North America, some species are declining, and not yet in Alberta, but I suspect that's going to be happening. So anything we can do to help our bats is great. And just to give you a taste of what you might see if you went to that Alberta Community Bat website, different guides. One is, well, what to do if you do have bats in your building. Is it okay to leave them, or how can you exclude them? And it's in those situations where it's a really good idea to put up another bat house for the bats if they're not going to be able to go back to the place they were used to roosting. A whole guide to building homes for bats, and even bat-friendly communities, what you can do around your community. So in your personal yard, your school yard, around the town, what you can do to make life better for bats. And just learning about bats is really important as well, because a lot of people are scared of bats or don't understand them. And so the more we learn about them, the better educated we are, and the more we appreciate them and want to help them. So anything we can do to help bats is good, and there's lots of resources out there. I'm going to move on to the second B, which is birds. Now, I mentioned that there are 9 species of bats in Alberta, only 9. Now, when we start looking at birds, there are over 400 kinds of birds in Alberta. So I thought I should narrow it down to the kind of birds that we see mostly in our communities around our backyards. And that would be like this little chickadee you see in the corner, the songbirds or the perching birds. And the actual official name for that is passerine. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our songbirds or our passerines. And the first thing that I wanted to talk about is they eat different things. I said the bats all eat insects. Well, some birds eat insects. Some birds eat berries, nuts, seeds, and you can get a good clue about their diet based on the shape and size of their beak. So you can see I've got these little circles around the beak. So everyone knows the robin there in the upper left-hand corner, and robins like worms. They have sharp, pointy beaks for that. The bird below that is a flycatcher. It also has a sharp, pointy beak. So it does eat flies. It eats insects. Now, if you look to the the right side of my screen, there's that beautiful yellow evening grosbeak. It's got a really big, fat beak. That beak is designed to crack seeds and nuts. Obviously, it's not a small, pointy, delicate beak that's going to be picking insects out of the air. Same with the junco below that. It's got a pretty chunky beak. So just by looking at the beak, you get an idea of what sort of food the birds in your backyard might be eating. Some birds, of course, have kind of an in-between beak and can eat both seeds and insects. And then one of our favorite birds and most specialized is the hummingbird. So their beak is totally unique, and I'm sure you know that it has that unique beak to dig deeply into flowers, deep on themselves, and they're incredibly important pollinators, just like bees, which we'll talk about in a second. And you know, one thing about these birds is, so the birds that eat insects or nectar aren't around in the summer. We all know that a lot of birds migrate south. Hummingbirds migrate too, and it's pretty incredible to think that these tiny little birds can actually migrate thousands of kilometers. So they're really incredible animals, and being able to help them out is important too. So I think everybody knows too that pretty much all our songbirds make their own nests in trees and in shrubs. So that's an important thing to consider. So just like with the bats, trees are important. Different kinds of trees that provide different types of habitat. Think about the pine trees that have cones, because birds eat cones, the seeds in there, just like squirrels. The different types of trees will support different types of insects or berries, and just gardens that have insects. Very healthy native vegetation is going to help to support our birds, both in terms of what they eat and where they live and raise their young. The hummingbird is very special, and something, if you were interested in hummingbirds, you could research a little bit more about is what are the native flowers that hummingbirds like the most around here. And especially having food for them in May when they're heading back up from their long migration is really helpful. And so if you want to give them an extra helping hand, you can actually get a hummingbird feeder. You could get them from Canadian Tire, and they eat sugar water. It's really wonderful to see these birds, and they are attracted to these brightly colored flowers, and that's why the bird feeders are red. Now, for the other kinds of birds, we probably don't need to worry about giving them extra food during the summer as long as we've got lots of the native plants around, because they're going to be able to get their food from those plants and the insects that are in the plants or the seeds. Winter can be a tougher time, and so the birds that don't migrate south are the ones that eat seeds. And so that's usually the best time for us to help those birds out by putting out seeds, because food does start to get to be pretty scarce. Certainly if you lived right in the middle of a city, you might want to put birdseed out in the summer, but otherwise in the winter. And it's also a pretty fun project to track the kinds of birds that come to the bird feeders. And then in the spring and the fall, the birds that are migrating through may come by and stop at your feeder. So that's always fun. For me, one of the first signs of spring is when I start to see some of the birds returning. We talked about nesting. So if we've got lots of places for lots of trees and plants, there's good places to nest. Sometimes we may not have enough nesting areas, so you can build birdhouses. We talked about bat houses. Bat houses are different because the holes are on the bottom, so the bats can climb up. I think everyone's familiar with this kind of a birdhouse where the birds will raise their young. And there are sometimes really specialized kind of birdhouses. This is for a bird called the pine martin. It's similar to the swallow in the picture. And you sometimes see these along edges of farmers' fields, and pine martin populations have been declining. And they found that these kind of, pine martin condos or bird condominiums are the types of houses that they like. And it's interesting, I've been talking a lot about insects, how the bats eat insects, some birds eat insects, and birds that eat insects exclusively, especially birds that are flying and they catch them on the wing, some of those bird species are starting to decline, and that's because some of our insect species are starting to decline. It's all part of climate change and just using too many pesticides and insecticides. So the more we can do to provide natural areas for these animals is going to be helpful. And yeah, it's kind of a theme here about how important insects are. There's lots of resources on the internet if you wanted to learn more about birds. And then, so continuing to talk about insects, bees, everybody likes bees, and they're familiar with the cute fuzzy bumblebees, but you may be surprised to learn there are over 300 species of bees in Alberta alone. I'm not a bee expert, but there's a huge amount of variety. So there's obviously a lot to learn. And just like we were talking about the birdhouses for different kinds of birds, it's the same for bees. It's not one size fits all. The one thing they have in common is they all eat pollen and nectar. I know you guys all know that they're so important for pollinators. They have their long tongues, they lick out the nectar, they get the pollen on their faces or on their legs, and travel around from flower to flower. So we know they're super important. And almost half of the crop plants that are grown that we use for food are pollinated by bees. So they play a pretty important role, not just in the ecosystem in helping plants grow, but also some of the plants that we eat. Just a quick reminder that if we had more time, we could talk about another bee, butterflies and moths. They're also pollinators. So the things that having these flowers and plants, things that help bees are going to help our other native pollinators as well. So when I said there's over 300 kinds of bees, it means there's a lot of different kinds. Certainly we have the honeybees that live in hives that people are most familiar with, but there are a lot of bees. Over probably about 3/4 of the bees are solitary. They live alone. And so they live in holes in the ground or in wood. So when we think about helping bees, we have to think about all the different kinds. So the first thing is flowers. If we want to help bees, we need lots of flowers, and especially native flowers. And having flowers, if you're planting a garden and thinking about bees, think about flowers that will start opening in the spring, and then other flowers that will open midsummer and then late summer. So you're providing lots of opportunities for pollen and nectar throughout the season, especially those native plants and shrubs. And if we want places, safe places for our bats to live, sorry, I keep talking about bats, our bees, especially thinking about those solitary bees. So places like old dead wood, even just piles of leaves, open soil where they can burrow into, places where solitary bees will live in the summer, and then also in the winter, because some bees will basically hibernate for the winter. And so they need places that they can just go into a state of deep sleep. And if you want to get really fancy, you can make a bee hotel. And you may have seen these. They're starting to become more popular. You can buy them or you can make them. Lots of different styles. And because we know bees are important, and unfortunately, I was talking about insects declining, bees are declining largely because of some of the pesticides that are being used are and insecticides are really not helping our native bees. And also if we're converting a lot of areas to just crops instead of the variety of plants that they're used to in the flowers, there's a lot less food for them. So it's really important that we help our bees. As I said, over almost half the crop plants that we eat are pollinated by bees. And we know that some I'm not sure about yet, and we have some sensitive species in Alberta, and certainly in Canada, we have threatened species. So what we can do to help them is really important. And a bee house is one thing you could do. And you can also get creative, and you could make a house that helps other insects as well, even that might help where a butterfly might be able to spend the winter. And so just like we have a group of people, the Community Bat Program, there's the Alberta Native Bee Council. And this is a great resource. It's fairly new just because over the last few years, we've been learning so much more about our bees and that they are in trouble. We need to help them. And so one of the ways you could do that is to build a bee hotel. There's a guide on this site that helps you to identify bees. And there's a program called Bumblebee Watch. And so you can actually submit your identifications of the local bees, because we really don't know all, even though I said there's over 300, there's probably more. There could be 40 or 50 more species of bees in Alberta we don't even know about, that we haven't identified. So that's pretty important. So this is a great site. So if you're thinking about gardens and helping local species, helping bees is a great way to do that. And I don't know, so it seems like my last slide just disappeared.
Yeah,
There,
it's
hopefully you
there
can.
for a flash.
Okay, can you see it now?
No, I can't at the moment.
Oh, how about that?
There, yeah, I could see it now.
Okay. So yeah, there are lots of resources to help native plants and insects. And by doing that, you help the bats, the birds, and the bees. And so for those of you who are already doing some work on gardens, maybe it's around the schoolyard or in your own yard, there's all sorts of things we can do to help, and just also teaching other people about what you're learning. And if you are doing projects, I'd also suggest putting up signs so that people who walk by and see what you're doing understand how important it is. And the resources I gave you have a lot of information for that. So that's a really quick run through about our bats, birds, our songbirds and bees in Alberta, and things we can do to help them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lisa. I learned a lot from your presentation. I had no idea that you could send in bat poo to get it tested.
Yeah, it comes to me.
Oh, that's awesome. So cool. Now we have just a couple of minutes here, so we'll open it up to questions. If you have any questions, feel free to either unmute or type them out in the chat, and we can ask ask Lisa a few questions. Lisa, maybe if it's okay too, is it all right if people think of questions later on, if they send me an email that I can pass along to you to answer those?
Sure, especially, yeah, if a teacher wants to gather all the questions together and send them on, I can do that.
Awesome, great. So if there's any questions now, we can take a couple of questions now, and otherwise I'll invite you to send them along to me and I'll pass them over to Lisa. So maybe while we wait to see if there's any questions, Lisa, do you have a favorite bat species?
That's a tough one. I studied big brown bats for my master's in medicine hat. They actually lived in the attics of 2 old school buildings. So
Wow.
the big brown's one of my favorites.
Okay. And do they roost in colonies, the big brown bats?
Yes, they do. A lot of bats do roost in colonies, the females, when they have their pups, and that way they're together and they stay warmer. The males tend to roost more on their own.
Okay. And correct me if I'm wrong, but bats, for the most part, they don't usually live in Alberta in the winter, right? Or if they do roost
No,
here.
some hibernate.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I didn't have time to talk about that, but most of our bat species hibernate, probably in Alberta. We only know of not even 10 caves, but we think they might be in cracks and crevices in rocky areas. And then we have 3 species that migrate. And yeah, they migrate. We don't know very much about them, but south to the southern US and Mexico. So
Awesome.
those little guys also make a pretty long journey, just like the hummingbirds. They're so tiny, yet they make these incredible journeys.
That's really amazing. It just astonishes me how many different animals are able to move so far from between the
Yeah,
seasons.
and birds too, for songbirds. Wow, they go down to, and some of the shorebirds, they fly like thousands of kilometers down to southern South America, the tip of South America, and back up to Alberta. And our boreal forest is home to some sensitive songbirds. And think about how important our boreal forest must be if they fly all the way up from South America every year to nest in that boreal forest. So we kind of take it for granted. It's a big forest, a big area, but yeah, it's really important, and we need to take care of it and make sure that it's going to continue to support all the animals that rely on it, especially those migrants who
Oh
come
yeah.
all this way.
Oh yeah, that's a really good point. I think you're right that
Mm,
sometimes we take for granted these spaces that we have, but
yeah,
just yeah, so important to protect them and do what we can. And want to say like that the projects that these different students are doing, it's like taking that first step to helping to protect the environment. So keep up the good work, everyone.
yeah, yeah. Every little step is helpful, and it just encourages other people to do it, right? The more you learn and you share what you learn, and once people begin to, the first step is appreciating, understand and appreciate, and then you start wanting to help.
I love
So,
it. Cool. Well, thanks so much, Lisa. And we have lots of thank yous coming in on the chat. So it sounds like everybody learned a lot and we're excited to learn more about the often overlooked bat. So thanks for sharing your knowledge and joining us today. Again, if anyone has any additional
yep,
questions from students, teachers, send them my way and I'll share those with Lisa. Otherwise, I hope that everybody enjoys the rest of their day and has a great weekend.
yeah, and thank you, and thanks for the great work you're doing.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Bye.
What do we say, grade 4? Thank you.